Okay, everybody, we're back. So now in this video, we're going to start on section 12.4. So as we transition from discussing the tools for environmental protection, we're now going to look at the question of whether or not these benefits that we receive from environmental regulations are worth the costs that they incur. So this section is going to look at that issue. It's important to recognize that, in the United States, firms invest significant resources in environmental compliance. In fact, estimates suggest that the U.S. firms collectively spend over $200 billion annually to adhere to federal environmental laws. So that's a substantial investment, and it naturally leads us to the question of, do the advantages of environmental regulations justify such a considerable expenditure? I would say they do. I'm a nature lover, right? I would certainly say that they do. But not everyone is of the same mind. So, all right. So learning outcomes at the end of this section, we want to evaluate the benefits and costs of environmental protection, explain the effects of ecotourism, and apply marginal analysis to illustrate the marginal costs and the marginal benefits of reducing pollution. So to begin our discussion of the benefits and the costs, let's acknowledge this tension that exists, right? We're spending $200 billion annually each year just to comply with the federal environmental laws. So that's a significant financial commitment. And the key question we have to ask here is whether or not the benefits that are derived are worth the costs. That's the central debate in environmental economics. And it requires a careful analysis of both the advantages and the disadvantages of these environmental protection measures. So let's first consider the many benefits that a cleaner environment provides. And I probably won't list them all here. You'll probably think of more. But these benefits, they're diverse. They impact society in numerous different ways. A cleaner environment leads to things like reduced illnesses and premature deaths, resulting from lesser pollution. It allows people to live healthier and longer lives. Certain industries that heavily rely on clean air and clean water, like farming and fishing and tourism, they benefit significantly from environmental protection. Cleaner environments enhance the attractiveness of communities for residents and businesses, and that potentially increases property values. And beyond the tangible, people also just enjoy a cleaner environment for its aesthetic and emotional value. I mean, just being able to appreciate scenic landscapes like the Grand Canyon. And, I'm looking at my Windows screensaver right now, and it is just this beautiful field of purple flowers with the horizon in the background. And it's just like, nature comes, it has countless benefits. How can you put a value on it? How can we as economists put a dollar value on nature? We can, but it's kind of a crazy thing. So when we attempt to quantify these benefits, we put a dollar value on these benefits of the environmental laws, the numbers are striking. For example, the EPA analysis of the Clean Air Act from 1970 to 1990, it estimated there was a total cost of $500 billion for the Clean Air Act in over 2 decades. But the estimated benefits were a staggering $22 trillion, approximately 44 times the cost. Now, how do we get these numbers? Who the hell knows, right? And it's going to depend on who's the number cruncher. Are they biased or not? Are they, neutral? We don't, I don't know. But just go with it. Now, more recent estimates for the 2010 Clean Air Act amendments alone suggest that there were benefits of around $110 billion, and that the cost-benefit ratio there was about 4-to-1. So it's crucial to remember there's a caveat here that not all regulations are equally cost-effective, and the benefits can vary significantly depending on the specific pollutant that's being addressed. And so again, it just highlights some of the complexity that we're dealing with. One specific area where environmental preservation and economic activity intersect with one another is ecotourism. So ecotourism is defined as tourism that is focused on appreciating and preserving ecosystems. It can provide significant economic benefits by creating incentives for preserving wildlife habits. Examples of some successful ecotourism destinations include South Africa and Costa Rica and the Galapagos Islands. But it's essential to recognize that the government and the community's roles in ensuring these revenue sharing policies, they have to align with the local and the environmental interests. So there are also some challenges associated with ecotourism, like the mismanagement risks that could harm ecosystems and potential stress or behavioral changes in wildlife that are exposed to this tourism. When you manage it effectively, ecotourism is generally viewed as a positive force, but it offers, it is something that's more complicated to manage, but it's also an alternative to the environmentally damaging activities that might take place in these spaces. Yeah, you could log that forest and earn some money from the wood, or you could leave it alone and it could become a tourism hotspot. So there's a balancing act, there's a trade-off. So to further analyze the economics of environmental protection, we can utilize the concept of marginal analysis. So looking at marginal costs and marginal benefits of pollution reduction. The marginal costs of reducing pollution generally increase as more pollution is reduced because the least expensive and easiest methods are typically employed first. Right? It's a low-hanging fruit, and that leaves behind more costly methods for later. We kind of talked about this in an earlier section when we talked about pollution charges. Well, there's an incentive to reduce pollution up to the pollution charge because we're saying the marginal cost is lower until you hit that pollution charge, and then the cost is higher because you're dealing with this exact situation where, the easiest things to reduce are the cheapest and the fastest, and you can maximize your benefits that way and not have to pay that tax. But at some point, it's just going to get prohibitively expensive to capture every single ounce of pollution. So on the other side, conversely, the marginal benefits of reducing pollution also tend to decrease as the environment becomes cleaner, because the most significant improvements in health and environmental quality are usually achieved with the initial reductions. So the efficiency point is reached when marginal benefits equal marginal costs. Notice I'm saying marginal benefits. Marginal benefits is not the same as marginal revenue. We're looking at a cost-benefit analysis here. The benefits, are harder to measure per se, just like I saw earlier with a couple of slides ago when we said the total costs of the Clean Air Act of 1970 was $500 billion. The total benefits was $22 trillion. So we're not talking about revenues. We're not saying marginal revenue. We're saying marginal benefits to society. And that's where I think some of the environmental economics is probably still has a ways to go. And how do we really define those benefits? How do we really make sure that number is accurate? Is it accurate to say that this act was 44 times more benefits than costs? I don't know. I think some of it's in the eye of the beholder. I think it's difficult to measure that kind of stuff. But that is kind of what we're looking at here when we compare the costs and the benefits. We can measure the costs pretty well, but the benefits are a little harder, I think, to do. But the idea, again, is the efficiency is achieved when they equal one another. And beyond this point, the costs of further reduction are going to outweigh the additional benefits, which leads to a resource misallocation. So we can visualize this with a theoretical model here as seen conceptually in the figure on the right. Marginal costs and marginal benefits are graphed here in a line or in a curve, and it looks a little bit like a supply and demand curve, but that's not what this is. But the idea is kind of the same, like marginal benefits as the quantity of environmental protection increases, as you try to capture more and more of that pollution and not let it out into the environment, it gets the benefits get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Same with the cost. The costs get higher and higher and higher and higher. So when the quantity of environmental protection is low, meaning that pollution is extensive at a level like QA here, we typically find that the marginal benefits of reducing pollution are quite high relative to the marginal costs, because it's usually that there are cheaper and easier ways to achieve some initial pollution reductions. At this stage, it makes economic sense to allocate more resources to environmental protection. But as the environmental protection increases, moving from, say, QA to QB and QC here maybe, but QB, the dynamic changes, right? The cheap and easy methods of reducing pollution begin to decrease, and we must resort to more costly methods, which causes the marginal cost curve to start to rise as the increases start. And then simultaneously, the largest marginal benefits are typically realized first, followed by a reduction in the benefits for subsequent reductions. So we do reach a point of equilibrium here where we say that's where we should be. Quantity B would be the correct answer in terms of economics, how much we want to reduce our pollution by. But then as this quantity of environmental protection continues to increase, reaching all the way to QC, past the point of the intersection between them two, the marginal costs are now exceeding the marginal benefits. So at this level, society is not allocating resources efficiently to environmental protection because the cost of each additional unit of pollution reduction is greater than the benefit received. In fact, it may be forfeiting too many resources to reduce pollution beyond this optimal point. So the goal is just to find a balance where marginal benefits and marginal costs are in closer alignment with one another, like the QB here. But like I said, that is a difficult thing to do. I think it's easy enough to recognize what the marginal costs would be. Marginal benefits is a little harder, and it's in the eye of the beholder because, I value the environment very highly. Someone else may not. How do you assign a dollar value to that? It's hard to do. So finally, when discussing the benefits and costs of environmental laws, we also have to consider how we value life, our life, human life, and the environmental trade-offs. The EPA, for instance, estimates that a person's life statistically is worth about $10.5 million in economic value in 2022. Which is kind of a morbid thing to say, that we value a person up to a certain dollar amount and they're not worth more than that. It's kind of a silly thing to think, but it's more of an intellectual exercise. And that's controversial, right? We don't really want to put a price tag on human life, but it is a kind of a necessary tool to determine, the cost effectiveness of environmental policies. It raises difficult ethical questions, right? What's, a key insight here is the trade-off that, excessively costly regulations, those that are more than, say, $50 million per life saved, if it costs marginal cost of $50 million to save one life, but a life is only worth $10.5 million, that's the marginal benefit is $10.5 million. Well, we're going to say that that's not economically efficient. We're going to say that we should divert resources from environmental protection. And in doing so, we're going to inadvertently cause harm in other areas. And that harm could very well cause cancer in somebody and make them, very sick and possibly die. So a policy implication here is this need to strive for cost-effective regulations that maximize societal well-being. And from an economic standpoint, you do have to consider the value of a human life. It's kind of a morbid thing, but that's what we have to do in some cases. It's just like how we say there's a certain amount of plastic that's allowed in products. There's a certain amount of, a chemical that's allowed in a product. Up to a certain point, it's okay, but past that point, you're starting to eat away into social well-being and societal well-being. So it's a careful balancing act, like all of this is. It's a careful balancing act, and a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder. So that's going to end this video. I don't like to end it on that note, but that is the note that we're going to end this one on. In the next video, we're going to talk about some international environmental issues. So I'll see you in that.